It is the 12th of April, 1945. The war in Europe has perhaps 5 weeks left to breathe. Somewhere in the rolling hills of central Germany, outside a small town most Americans have never heard of and never will again, a convoy of jeeps pulls to a stop on a dirt road churned to mud by the wheels of retreating armies. General George S. Patton steps out. He does not look like a man who has just won. He looks like a man who is about to make someone reckon with what they have done. Beside him, in crisp if slightly dusty dress uniform, stands an SS Obersturmbannführer, a lieutenant colonel of the Waffen-SS, who has just been taken into American custody. The German officer has already asked, twice, for legal representation. He has invoked the Geneva Convention. He has spoken of his rights as a prisoner of war, his rank, his entitlements. He is educated. He is composed. He is, in the language of 1945, cooperating. Patton listens, and then, without a word, he gestures for the man to follow him down the road. What happens in the next 30 minutes does not appear in the clean official records. It is reconstructed from soldier testimony, from the accounts of journalists present that day, and from Patton's own diary, which is blunt in ways that official correspondence never is. What we know is this. Before the SS officer is allowed to say another word about lawyers, before any processing or paperwork or prisoner protocol can begin, Patton walks him to the edge of a field and makes him look. The question of what an educated man, a man with rank and uniform and professional pride, does when he is made to stand in front of the evidence of his own institution's crimes, is one of the most disturbing questions the 20th century asks of us. And it is a question that the spring of 1945 posed over and over again across Germany. George Patton, for all his theatrics and his notoriety and his controversial command decisions, answered it in a particular way. He did not argue. He did not lecture. He simply showed. This is the story of that reckoning, of what American forces found in the concentration camps of central Germany, of what Patton chose to do about it, and of why one man's insistence on bearing witness may be one of the most quietly significant acts of the entire Western campaign. To understand what Patton was dealing with in April 1945, you need to understand what the final weeks of the war in the West actually looked like on the ground, and how little prepared even the most battle-hardened Allied commanders were for what they found as they pushed into German territory. By early April, the Wehrmacht's organized resistance in the West had effectively collapsed. The Rhine had been crossed. German units were surrendering in their thousands. Patton's Third Army was slicing through Bavaria at a speed that surprised even its own supply chain, covering distances in days that planners had penciled in for weeks. By all conventional military metrics, things were going remarkably well. But the liberating armies were moving into territory that held secrets, or rather, secrets that had never truly been secrets, but had been allowed to exist behind a curtain of strategic denial and international indifference. The concentration camp system of the Third Reich was not hidden. Its existence had been reported, discussed and documented since the early 1930s. Jewish organizations had been raising the alarm for years. Refugee testimony had reached Allied capitals. The question was not whether the camps existed. The question was what kind of mental architecture allowed people, including Allied governments and commanders, to hold that knowledge at arm's length. That architecture collapsed in April 1945. On April 4th, Patton's 4th Armoured Division stumbled upon Ohrdruf, a sub-camp of the Buchenwald concentration camp complex, located near the town of Gotha in Thuringia. It was not one of the largest camps in the Nazi system. It was not, in terms of its machinery of death, among the most industrialized. But it was the first camp of its kind to be liberated by American forces, and what the soldiers of the 4th Armoured found there was beyond the capacity of most of them to process. Approximately 10,000 prisoners had passed through Ohrdruf since its establishment in late 1944. They had been used as forced labour, primarily in the construction of an underground communications network for the German military. In the final weeks before liberation, as Allied forces closed in, the SS had conducted forced marches, shooting those too weak to walk. Bodies were found stacked, burned in pits, left where they had fallen. The soldiers who entered Ohrdruf, men who had fought their way through North Africa and Normandy and the Bulge, were sick in the road. Some wept. Some simply could not speak. Word reached Patton and General Dwight Eisenhower within days. Both men came to see for themselves. Eisenhower's response is perhaps better documented. He ordered that as many soldiers as possible be brought through the camps, specifically so that no one could later claim ignorance, and he cabled Washington demanding that congressmen and journalists be sent to bear witness. But Patton's response was in some ways more visceral, and it set a personal pattern that would play out repeatedly in the weeks that followed. He made people look. The camps that Patton's forces encountered in the spring of 1945 shared certain features that the military men who found them struggled to categorize within their existing understanding of warfare and human behavior. These were not prisoner-of-war facilities. They were not even exactly prisons in any conventional sense. They were systems, bureaucratic, logistical, industrial systems designed with the same professional attention to efficiency that the German state had applied to its railway network or its armaments production. Ohrdruf had a roll call square where prisoners had been made to stand in all weather conditions while guards counted and recounted them, sometimes for hours. It had gallows. It had a whipping table, a wooden construction worn smooth from use. It had a building for storing clothing, sorted, folded, labelled, taken from people who were no longer alive to wear it. When Patton arrived in the days following its discovery, he brought General Omar Bradley with him. Bradley later wrote that Patton, upon entering the camp, turned away and was visibly sick. This is almost never mentioned alongside the image most people carry of Patton, the pearl-handled revolvers, the theatrical bravado, the slapping incident, but it is documented. The general who cultivated an image of absolute iron composure, who had driven his staff to exhaustion with his relentlessness, who had stood in shell fire without flinching, was broken, briefly, by what he saw at Ohrdruf. And then he made a decision. He ordered that the mayor of the nearby town of Gotha and his wife be brought to the camp and made to walk through it. He ordered that German civilians from the surrounding area be compelled to view the bodies. He did this not as punishment, or not only as punishment, but as a deliberate act of historical witnessing. He believed, with a conviction that comes through in his diary entries from this period, that the proximity of German civilian communities to these camps was not coincidental, and that the post-war claim of ignorance, which he correctly anticipated would become the dominant German civilian narrative, was not one he was prepared to permit, at least within his area of command. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The mayor of Gotha and his wife walked through Ohrdruf on 5th April 1945. That night, they returned home and hanged themselves. It is within this context, this deliberate, systematic insistence on confrontation, that the encounter with the SS officer must be understood. The precise identity of the officer in question is one of those details that sits in the uncertain territory between documented history and the oral record of soldiers who were present. Several accounts refer to him as a Waffen-SS Obersturmbannführer captured in the vicinity of Ohrdruf, or one of the sub-camps in the region. What the accounts agree on is the nature of his initial response to capture. He was professional, composed, and immediately concerned with legal procedure. He asked for a lawyer. He asked for the Geneva Convention to be observed. He presented himself as a regular military officer entitled to the protections afforded to prisoners of war. Patton, by all accounts, was not interested in this framing. The Waffen-SS occupied a legally and morally complex position in 1945. As a military formation, its members could plausibly claim prisoner of war status under the Geneva Convention, a claim that would eventually be contested and litigated in ways that would occupy military lawyers and international tribunals for years. But many individual SS units had been directly involved in atrocities, in the running of the camp system, in the execution of prisoners, in operations that bore no relationship to conventional military conduct. The officer standing before Patton may, or may not, have had direct blood on his hands. That question, in the immediate moment, was one for tribunals yet to be convened. What Patton did instead was simpler and, in its way, more devastating than any legal argument. He walked the man to the mass grave. No speech, no accusation, no formal charge, just the evidence itself, the bodies, the scale, the smell that survivors and liberating soldiers consistently describe as unlike anything else in human experience, a smell that clung to clothing and hair and memory for years afterward. The SS officer was made to stand there and look at what the institution he had served had produced. What the officer said or did not say in those minutes is not recorded with precision. What is recorded is that his requests for legal representation ceased, and that when formal processing did eventually occur, he was notably less composed than he had been on arrival. Patton's insistence on witness was not unique among Allied commanders in the spring of 1945, but it was unusually personal and unusually consistent. He applied it to civilians, to captured SS personnel, to his own soldiers, some of whom he ordered through the camps specifically because he feared, with considerable accuracy as it turned out, that the experience of liberation would fade from public consciousness once the war was over. The broader liberation of the camps by American, British, Soviet, and other Allied forces in the spring of 1945 produced one of the most significant bodies of documentary evidence in the history of warfare. Eisenhower, understanding instinctively that what they were witnessing would be disbelieved by future generations, ordered extensive photographic and film documentation. The footage shot by Army Signal Corps cameramen in April and May of 1945 remains among the most important historical records ever created, and it was created precisely because commanders like Eisenhower and Patton understood that witness, documented and multiplied, was the only reliable counter to denial. The atrocities uncovered were on a scale that defied comprehension in conventional military terms. Estimates of the total death toll within the Nazi concentration and extermination camp system, which must be distinguished from the broader death toll of the Holocaust, which included mass shootings, ghetto deaths, and other methods, run to several million. The camps liberated by Western Allied forces in 1945, including Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and the subcamps of systems like Neuengamme, held hundreds of thousands of survivors in states of starvation and disease so severe that many continued to die for weeks after liberation, despite the best efforts of Allied medical teams. The death toll at Bergen-Belsen alone in the weeks following its liberation by British forces on the 15th of April 1945 ran to several thousand. Patton's legacy is, to put it gently, complicated. He was, by any assessment, one of the most gifted operational commanders of the Second World War. He was also temperamentally unsuited to the political and administrative realities of post-war occupation, a fact that eventually led to his removal from command of the Third Army in October 1945, partly due to remarks he made comparing Nazi party membership to membership of a political party, remarks that caused outrage and reflected a blinkered pragmatism that sat very uneasily with what his own forces had uncovered at Ohrdruf and Buchenwald. The man who walked an SS officer to a mass grave, and the man who later mused about the practical difficulties of denazification are the same man. History rarely gives us the clean moral clarity we prefer, but the act itself, the refusal to allow legal procedure to substitute for confrontation with reality, carries a weight that survives Patton's contradictions. There is something in that gesture, that silent walk down a dirt road to the edge of a field, that cuts through every abstraction, every bureaucratic defense, every claim of rank and entitlement and ignorance. You asked for a lawyer. Here is what your organization did. Look at it.